The sound that ended James McCready's career as a fighting man was not the sound of a fist. It was a wet, pressurized pop, followed immediately by a silence from McCready himself that was more disturbing to the witnesses than any scream would have been. The silence of a nervous system so overwhelmed by what had just happened to the left side of his face that it had not yet determined what response was appropriate. The man standing over him was not holding a weapon. He was wiping his thumb on his trouser leg. The crowd around the edges of the clearing did not intervene. There were no rules being broken. This was a fight working as designed, and the fight was not finished yet. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today we are going to ground, not to the street at high noon with two men, and a clear sight line, and the elegant choreography of the draw, to the mud, where two men in the grip of something older and less structured than dueling were engaged in a tradition of combat that the American frontier's southern and western territories developed and refined and exported across the continent. A tradition with one objective that was not victory in the way that sports understand victory, but permanent alteration of the person you were fighting, a message written in scar tissue that the recipient would carry for the rest of their life. You're going to discover the specific techniques of rough and tumble fighting, what the men who practiced it were actually trying to accomplish when they went aground, and what the frontier looked like in the faces of the men who lost. John Wayne solved fights with his fists. The formula was reliable and the choreography was clean, and the outcome was always a man on the floor, and another man still standing who could turn to the bar and communicate, through the simple act of ordering a drink, that the matter was settled and the evening could continue. The punches landed with a sound that the Foley artists of Hollywood developed into its own genre of percussive clarity, each impact precisely audible, the sequence building to a conclusion that was decisive and visible and left no ambiguity about who had won and what winning meant. What winning meant in the actual fighting culture of the American frontier territories, particularly in the Appalachian backcountry that supplied a significant portion of the frontier's population, and in the settlements of the Deep South and the rough western expansion communities those populations seated, was not a man on the floor. It was a man marked, permanently, visibly, undeniably marked in a way that every person who encountered him for the rest of his life would be able to read. The marking was the point. The pain was the delivery mechanism. The scar, the empty socket. The ear gone to the jaw of someone who had been winning when the bite landed. These were the receipts of a loss that the frontier's social economy did not permit to be forgotten or minimized or misrepresented. You carried the evidence of having been in the moat and having come up short. And you carried it in the one location that no clothing could cover and no darkness could conceal. The fighting style that produced these outcomes was called rough and tumble or gouging, depending on which element of it the person using the term was emphasizing, and it had rules in the technical sense that it had a body of accepted practice. But the rules were not the rules of boxing, which existed to regulate and limit what two men could do to each other in competition. The rules of rough and tumble were the rules of a practice that existed specifically to remove those limits. You could bite, you could tear. You could use every part of your body as a weapon and direct that weapon at every part of your opponent's body. And the objective was not to render him unconscious or to accumulate points or to force him to submit in a way that preserved his physical integrity. The objective was to leave him different from how you found him. The thumb was a primary instrument, and the men who fought seriously in this tradition treated it accordingly. The thumbnail was not trimmed. It was grown and maintained and shaped with a specific application in mind, hardened by the deliberate process of repeated pressure against hard surfaces until the nail thickened and the edge became something that the word instrument is not an exaggeration to apply to. In the clinch, in the grapple that began most rough and tumble encounters and determined much of their outcome, the hands of both men were seeking the same targets, the orbital structures around the eye, the soft tissue of the cheek and the nose and the ear, the parts of the face that the body's architecture had not provided with bone protection, because the evolutionary history of the human face had not anticipated this specific application. The grip that preceded the gouge was not casual. It was the grip of a man who had done this before or trained to do this. Both hands engaged the opponent's head in a configuration that controlled the movement of the target, while positioning the dominant thumb. The leverage was specific. The angle was specific. The men who were good at this were good at it in the way that any practiced physical skill produces competence, through repetition and the accumulated knowledge of what worked and what did not work, and what the body on the other end of the technique would do in response to each variation. When the thumb found the orbit and applied pressure, the response of the body on the receiving end was not a response that could be managed through willpower or toughness, or any of the qualities that frontier masculinity had developed elaborate systems for demonstrating. The body's defense of the eye is hardwired below the level of conscious decision at a depth that the most determined frontier man could not override through intention. Every resource the body could redirect toward the defense of that structure redirected immediately and completely. The muscles of the neck and shoulder and trunk that had been engaged in the mechanics of the fight were now engaged in a single desperate attempt to move the head away from the pressure, and the man applying the pressure had anticipated this response and was using the reflexive movement against the person making it, following the recoil and maintaining the position, and continuing the application. The accounts written by witnesses to rough and tumble contests in the late 18th and early 19th century American frontier describe the moment of successful gouging with consistent vocabulary that suggests these writers were reaching for the same words because the same words were the most accurate ones available. Wet, sudden, wrong. The eye is a pressurized structure maintained by the intraocular fluid that gives its form and function, and a pressure applied to the exterior that exceeds its structural tolerance produces a response that the body of the person watching registers through every sensory channel simultaneously. The sound, the immediate collapse of the geometric integrity of what had been an eye, the fluid, the fighter's thumb emerging from the orbit with the evidence of what it had accomplished still adhering to it. The man who had just lost the eye was still in the fight, in most accounts, at least briefly. The shock response that the nervous system produces in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic injury is not unconsciousness. It is a state of biological emergency management in which the systems not directly involved in survival are suppressed, and the systems that are directly involved are activated at maximum output. And in a fighting context, the system most directly involved in survival was still fighting. Men continue to grapple and bite and tear after losing an eye, operating on the neurochemical surplus of an emergency response that had not yet received the information that the situation was already irreversible. The bite was the other instrument, and it was applied without the preparation or the positioning that the thumb required, because the jaw requires less setup than the thumb, and the opportunities for its application arose throughout the fight rather than depending on achieving a specific grip configuration. The ears were accessible in the clinch in a way that the eyes were not, presented by the geometry of two men with their heads together, and the cartilage of the ear, which has no pain receptors of its own, but is attached to tissue that has abundant ones, separated from the skull under sufficient jaw pressure with the clean resistance of gristle, which is what it was. The men who had participated in multiple rough and tumble contests and accumulated the evidence of those contests in their faces and on the sides of their heads wore that accumulation in a way that was legible to everyone who encountered them. The nose offered a different set of targets and a different set of outcomes. The external structure of the nose, the cartilage and soft tissue that extends from the face, is not architecturally defended the way that the orbital bones defend the eye, and in the specific context of a close-range rough and tumble grapple, it was accessible from multiple angles and to multiple tools simultaneously. The accounts that document nose injuries in frontier fighting are accounts of noses being bitten, torn, compressed against the bone by impacts that remove structural integrity without removing the structure, and in the cases where removal did occur, the removal was complete, and the result was a deficit in the center of the face that no amount of time would address and no medicine available to the frontier could reconstruct. The bite as a weapon has a particular place in the rough and tumble tradition because it combined the qualities that the tradition valued most. It was intimate in a way that weapons are not, requiring the absolute closing of distance, the total engagement of two bodies in proximity that left nothing between the jaw and the target. It was humiliating in the specific currency of frontier masculinity, which placed enormous weight on the quality of being someone who could not be dominated, and being bitten and marked by the teeth of another man in a public contest was a form of domination that the mark on the face would confirm for every subsequent encounter. And it was permanent in the way that the tradition required outcomes to be permanent, because of bruised heels and a broken bone sets, and a man who has only been hit can argue, to himself and to others, that the outcome might have been different under different circumstances. A man with a section of his ear missing cannot make that argument. The evidence disagrees. There was no surgery available to the man who left a rough and tumble contest missing tissue from his face. There was wound management of the kind the frontier provided. which was the wound management of available materials and practical knowledge, and the understanding that infection was a serious risk without a clear comprehension of why infection was a serious risk or what specifically to do about it. The empty socket where the eye had been was a wound that would heal as the frontier's wounds healed, slowly and imperfectly, and with continuous negotiation between the body's repair mechanisms and the contaminated environment of frontier daily life. It would heal into a scar, or it would not heal cleanly, and it would become infected, and the infection would become the next problem in a sequence of problems that the original fight had set in motion. What remained on the face after healing was what remained. The frontier had no cosmetic surgery. It had no reconstructive capacity of any kind that addressed the specific damage that rough and tumble produced. The man who lost the fight wore the loss in the permanent geography of his altered face, and the frontier's social reading of that alteration was not uncomplicated. The missing ear and the empty socket were not read purely as evidence of defeat. They were also read as evidence of participation. A man whose face carried the marks of rough and tumble had been in the moat, as the frontier expression understood it, had descended to the level of fighting where the rules of ordinary social engagement were suspended, and what happened was determined by who was willing to go further and had the physical capacity to take the other man there. Surviving that process, even on the losing end of it, demonstrated a tolerance for damage and a willingness to engage at that level that carried its own weight in a social environment that valued toughness as both a practical necessity and an identity. A man with an empty socket and intact nerve was a man who had been in something serious and had come through it still walking. The ambiguity of whether he had won or lost could be managed in the telling. The fact that he had been there could not be questioned and was not questioned because the evidence was on his face, and the evidence was not going anywhere. The men who lost everything in these fights, who were not just marked but broken, who lost the eye and then the infection, and then the fever that the infected socket produced, and then the delirium, and then whatever came after the delirium, were the ones that tradition produced as its final argument against itself. The culture of rough and tumble was a culture that had decided, through accumulated practice and social reinforcement, that the permanent physical alteration of another person's face was an acceptable resolution to the kinds of disputes that frontier life generated. It had decided this in an environment with mechanisms that might have offered alternative resolutions, functioning courts, reliable law enforcement, the kind of institutional presence that makes physical violence a less necessary arbiter of social standing, were not reliably present. The fighting was a substitute for systems that did not exist, and it produced the outcomes that any system produces when it is the only system available, which is to say it produced those outcomes consistently and at scale and with consequences that its participants were not always fully positioned to anticipate when they entered the clearing. The face of a frontier fighting man was a map of his history. Every mark on it was a specific event, a specific opponent, a specific night in a specific settlement with a combination of rot-gut whiskey and wounded pride and the absence of any authority invested with the power to prevent what was about to happen and converge into the specific circumstances that rough and tumble required. The map was permanent. The cartographer was whoever had been standing closest when the night went wrong, which is your honest answer. The street at noon, where the outcome is fast and the loss is final but clean, and you do not have to live inside the consequences for the following 30 years. Or the clearing, where the outcome is slow and intimate and conducted at the distance of breath, where losing means carrying the evidence of it in the center of your face for every day of whatever life remains after fight ends. There's a version of courage in both answers. There's also a very specific kind of fear in both answers, and the fear is different, and knowing which fear is yours is something that only you can determine. Leave it in the comments. And if the damage that human hands could do to the exterior of the frontier body has tested your threshold for what this channel covers, the damage that the frontier's medicine was simultaneously doing to the interior of that same body was operating on an equivalent scale with equivalent tools, an equivalent disregard for what was being left behind when the procedure was complete. The physicians with their unclean hands and their iron instruments and their pre-bacteriological confidence are waiting for you on the screen. Click on our video about the biological terror inside the frontier hospital. What happened when the doctor arrived was sometimes the thing that finished what the fight had started. Raw, visceral, history, this is the raw frontier.